Close your eyes and listen. Do you hear it? That warm, golden sound floating through the air like honey in sunlight. That's the voice of the flugelhorn, and for decades, no one made it sing quite like Chuck Mangione. Yesterday, that magical voice fell silent forever when the jazz legend passed away peacefully in his sleep at his Rochester, New York home at the age of 84. But this isn't just a story about an ending. This is the story of a man who took a lesser-known brass instrument and turned it into pure emotion, who bridged the gap between complex jazz and mainstream America, and who proved that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the deepest places in the human heart. Picture Rochester, New York in the 1940s. The city is alive with the sounds of industry, but in a modest Italian-American household, something else is stirring. Charles Frank Mangione was born on November 29, 1940, into a family where music wasn't just entertainment, it was lifeblood. His father, Charles Sr., ran a small grocery store, but the real nourishment in the Mangione household came from the melodies that filled their home. The young Chuck didn't start with the flugelhorn that would make him famous. Like many jazz musicians of his generation, he began with the trumpet, that bright, bold voice that commanded attention. But even as a child, there was something different about Chuck's approach to music. While other kids played with toys, he was already discovering that music could be a language all its own, capable of expressing feelings that words could never capture. The transformation began in the 1960s when Chuck found himself in one of jazz's most prestigious finishing schools, Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers. He came to prominence as a member of Art Blakey's band in the 1960s, learning from one of the greatest band leaders in jazz history. But Blakey's band was notorious for being tough love personified. Musicians didn't just learn notes and rhythms, they'd learned how to pour their souls into their instruments. It was during this period that Chuck made a discovery that would change everything. The flugelhorn, a brass instrument that looked like a trumpet's softer, more introspective cousins, seemed to speak to something deep within him. Where the trumpet announced, the flugelhorn whispered. Where the trumpet demanded attention, the flugelhorn invited intimacy. In Chuck's hands, it became something magical, an extension of his heart. The late 1960s found Chuck back in Rochester. But he wasn't returning as a defeated musician crawling home. He later co-led the Jazz Brothers with his brother, Gap, and together they began crafting a sound that was uniquely their own. The Jazz Brothers weren't trying to replicate what was happening in New York or Los Angeles. They were creating something new, something that honored jazz tradition while reaching toward a broader audience. But it was the 1970s that would see Chuck Mangione step into the spotlight in a way that no one could have predicted. Jazz, for all its artistic merit, had become increasingly complex and sometimes alienating to mainstream audiences. Free jazz and fusion were pushing boundaries, but they were also pushing away listeners who just wanted music that made them feel good. Chuck sensed an opportunity not to dumb down jazz, but to open it up. The recording sessions for what would become Feels So Good weren't initially meant to create a masterpiece. Chuck was experimenting with melodies that had been floating around in his head for years. The title track emerged from a simple desire to create music that lived up to its name. And when that flugelhorn began its now iconic melody, something magical happened in the studio. Everyone knew they were hearing something special. Feels So Good wasn't just a song, it was a revelation. Released in 1977, it did something that jazz instrumentals rarely accomplished. It conquered the pop charts. The track climbed to number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100, an almost unheard-of achievement for a jazz instrumental. Suddenly, Chuck Mangione wasn't just a musician's musician, he was a household name. But success brought unexpected challenges. Jazz purists questioned whether Chuck had sold out, while pop audiences sometimes didn't know what to make of his more complex compositions. Chuck found himself walking a tightrope between artistic integrity and commercial appeal, trying to honor both the sophisticated jazz tradition he came from and the broader audience he had discovered. The pressure might have crushed a lesser artist. But Chuck used it as fuel for creativity. He earned 14 Grammy nominations, winning 2 over his career. But more importantly, he continued evolving his sound. Each album was an exploration, a journey into new emotional territory. Then came 1980, and an opportunity that seemed tailor-made for Chuck's particular gifts. Mangione composed and performed "Give It All You Got," the theme song for the 1980 Winter Olympics in Lake Placid. He grew up in nearby Rochester. Imagine the full circle moment. A kid from upstate New York creating the musical backdrop for the world's athletes competing, just miles from where he first discovered his love for music. The Olympics performance was more than just a professional triumph, it was a homecoming. Standing before an international audience, Chuck's flugelhorn sang out over the snowy mountains of Lake Placid, carrying with it decades of dreams, struggles, and pure musical joy. For those few minutes, the entire world was listening to the sound that had first emerged from a modest home in Rochester. But Chuck's story was never just about the big moments. Throughout his career, he remained deeply connected to his roots in Rochester. While other successful musicians fled to New York or Los Angeles, Chuck chose to stay home. He became not just a famous son of the city, but an active part of its cultural life. The flugelhorn and trumpet player was inducted into the Rochester Music Hall of Fame in 2012. But by then, he had already spent decades giving back to the community that had nurtured him. His commitment to music education was legendary. Chuck didn't just perform, he taught, mentored, and inspired countless young musicians. He understood that music wasn't just about individual achievement, but about passing on a living tradition. In schools and community centers throughout Rochester, young musicians learned not just how to play their instruments, but how to find their own musical voices. The cultural impact of Chuck's music extended far beyond the jazz world. Feels So Good became more than a hit song, it became a cultural touchstone. It appeared in movies, commercials, and television shows. It became the kind of music that defined an era, instantly transporting listeners back to a specific time and feeling. In an age of increasingly fragmented musical tastes, Chuck had created something universal. His television appearances, including memorable spots on The Tonight Show and his own specials, revealed another side of Chuck's artistry. He wasn't just a musician. He was an entertainer who understood that performance was about connection. His warm smile and genuine enthusiasm for his craft made him a natural on screen, helping to introduce jazz to audiences who might never have encountered it otherwise. The 1980s and 1990s saw Chuck continuing to evolve, exploring different musical territories while never losing the warm, accessible sound that had made him famous. He collaborated with symphony orchestras, experimented with different ensembles, and continued releasing albums that showcased his growth as both a composer and performer. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Chuck Mangione was his consistency of character. Success never seemed to change his fundamental decency or his connection to his community. Colleagues described him as generous with his time and knowledge, always willing to help younger musicians or support local causes. He remained, at heart, the same person who had first discovered the magic of music in his family's Rochester home. The musician had been retired since 2015. But retirement for Chuck wasn't about stopping, it was about transitioning. He continued to be involved in music education and remained a beloved figure in Rochester's cultural community. Even when he was no longer performing regularly, his influence continued to ripple outward through the students he had taught and the musicians he had inspired. The news of his passing brings a profound sense of loss, but also an opportunity for celebration. Chuck Mangione didn't just leave behind a catalog of beautiful music, he left behind a legacy of joy, accessibility, and the proof that artistic excellence and popular appeal don't have to be mutually exclusive. In a world that often seems divided by complex categories and genres, Chuck's music reminds us of something fundamental. The best art speaks to our common humanity. His flugelhorn didn't know the difference between jazz purists and pop fans. It simply sang with a voice that touched hearts across all boundaries. Perhaps his biggest hit, Feels So Good, is a staple on most smooth jazz radio stations, ensuring that new generations will continue to discover the warm, golden sound that made Chuck Mangione a legend. But his true legacy lies not just in that one perfect song, but in the example he set. That music can be both sophisticated and accessible. That success doesn't require abandoning your roots, and that the most powerful art comes from a place of genuine love and joy. As we say goodbye to Chuck Mangione, we're not just mourning the loss of a great musician, we're celebrating a life that proved music's power to unite, to heal, and to make everything feel just a little bit better. In a career that spanned more than 5 decades, he gave us the gift of beauty, the comfort of melody, and the reminder that sometimes the most profound emotions can be expressed without a single word. The flugelhorn may be silent now, but the music lives on. Every time someone discovers Feels So Good for the first time, every time a young musician picks up a brass instrument and dreams of making it sing, every time someone finds comfort in a melody that seems to understand exactly how they feel, Chuck Mangione's spirit continues. He taught us that jazz doesn't have to be intimidating, that instrumental music can tell stories as powerful as any song with words, and that the best music comes from artists who never forget where they came from. In the end, Chuck Mangione did exactly what his most famous song promised. He made it all feel so good. Rest in peace, Chuck. Thank you for the music, the joy, and the reminder that beauty is always worth pursuing. Your flugelhorn may be quiet now, but the echoes of your music will resonate forever.